Kanye West thought he could lecture Jasmine Crockett about business and success. What happened next destroyed his empire and proved that real intelligence beats manufactured genius every time. The Goldman Sachs conference room on the 47th floor of their Manhattan headquarters was buzzing with the kind of energy that only comes when serious money is on the table. It was the annual Future of American Enterprise Summit, where tech moguls, entertainment executives, and political leaders gathered to discuss economic policy and investment opportunities. The mahogany table stretched nearly 20 feet, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city below. Kanye West sat near the head of the table, wearing one of his signature oversized hoodies and designer sneakers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He'd been invited as part of a panel on creative industries and economic impact, though everyone knew his presence was more about generating headlines than actual policy discussion. His Yeezy brand was still worth billions on paper, and his influence in fashion and music made him a coveted voice in business circles, despite his increasingly erratic public behavior. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat 3 seats down from him, wearing a sharp navy suit and carrying the same leather portfolio that had become her trademark in congressional hearings. She'd been invited to discuss proposed legislation on small business development and creative industry tax incentives. Unlike Kanye, she'd actually read the briefing materials and come prepared with specific policy proposals. The moderator, a senior Goldman Sachs executive named Richard Steinberg, was trying to guide the conversation towards substantive policy discussion. Representative Crockett, you've proposed significant changes to how we support emerging businesses in creative industries. Can you walk us through your thinking? Crockett opened her portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The creative economy represents over $900 billion in annual economic activity, but the vast majority of that wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few major corporations and individual superstars. Meanwhile, the artists, designers, musicians, and creators who actually drive innovation struggle to access capital, build sustainable businesses, or retain ownership of their intellectual property. She looked around the table. My legislation would create tax incentives for investment in creator-owned businesses, establish federal grants for artistic entrepreneurship, and reform copyright law to ensure that creators retain more control over their work. Kanye had been fidgeting in his chair throughout her presentation, occasionally muttering under his breath. Finally, he couldn't contain himself any longer. Hold up, hold up, he interrupted, his voice cutting through the polite conference room atmosphere. With all due respect, Congresswoman, you don't understand how business really works. You're talking about government handouts and regulations, but real entrepreneurs don't need that. Real visionaries create their own opportunities. The room fell silent. Everyone knew Kanye's reputation for outbursts, but this was supposed to be a professional policy discussion, not a reality TV show. Crockett looked at him calmly. I'm sorry, could you clarify what you mean by real entrepreneurs? Kanye leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged in a room full of people afraid to contradict him. Look at what I built. Yeezy is worth $6 billion. I didn't need government help. I didn't need handouts. I had a vision, I executed it, and I created one of the most valuable brands in the world. That's how business works. He gestured dismissively. You politicians, you think you can just throw money at problems and they'll go away. But you've never built anything. You've never created jobs. You've never had to meet a payroll or worry about quarterly earnings. You don't understand the pressure, the risk, the genius it takes to succeed at this level? Several people around the table shifted uncomfortably. The Goldman Sachs executives looked like they wanted to crawl under the mahogany surface, but Crockett didn't flinch. That's interesting, she said, reaching into her portfolio again, because I've been doing some research on your business model, Kanye. And I think there might be some things about how business really works that you haven't mentioned. She pulled out a thick folder and opened it on the table. Let's start with Yeezy's valuation. You claim it's worth $6 billion, but that's based on projections and licensing deals, not actual revenue or profit. According to the financial documents your company filed with the SEC, Yeezy's actual annual revenue is closer to $400 million, with profit margins around 15%. That's successful, certainly, but it's not the empire you describe. Kanye's confident smirk started to falter. Those numbers are outdated. We're projecting. Projections aren't the same as reality, Crockett interrupted smoothly. But let's talk about how you actually built this business, since you mentioned not needing help. She flipped to another page. Yeezy's success is built on your partnership with Adidas, which provides all manufacturing distribution and marketing infrastructure. Adidas fronted the capital investment handles all production costs, manages global supply chains, and takes responsibility for quality control. Your role is primarily creative direction and brand promotion. She looked directly at him. In other words, you didn't build a business from scratch. You licensed your name and creative input to an existing multinational corporation that had the resources and infrastructure to turn your ideas into products. The room was getting quieter by the minute. Kanye tried to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. But here's where it gets really interesting. She continued, pulling out another document. Adidas is a German company that benefits from massive government subsidies. They receive tax breaks, export incentives, and infrastructure support from the German government. They also benefit from trade agreements negotiated by governments, intellectual property protections, enforced by courts, and shipping routes secured by military forces. She spread several papers across the table. The factories that make Yeezy products. They're located in countries where governments provide cheap labor through suppressed wages and limited worker protections. The materials come from suppliers who benefit from agricultural subsidies and resource extraction agreements negotiated by governments. The shipping happens on routes protected by international maritime law and naval forces. Kanye was starting to look uncomfortable, but Crockett was just getting started. And let's not forget your personal background, Kanye. You grew up in Chicago, where you attended public schools funded by taxpayers. You went to Chicago State University, a public institution supported by government funding. Your mother was a professor at that same university. Her salary was paid by taxpayers. She flipped another page. When you started making music, you used equipment and software developed through government-funded research. The internet platforms that helped you build your early fan base, built on infrastructure created through government investment. The copyright laws that protect your intellectual property, enforced by federal courts. The conference room was dead silent now. Even the Goldman Sachs executives were leaning forward, watching this systematic dismantling of one of their most high-profile guests. But wait, there's more, Crockett said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. Your fashion career took off when you moved to New York. You lived in an apartment building that received tax abatements from the city. You showed your early designs at Fashion Week events that were partially funded by tourism boards and economic development agencies. You built relationships with industry executives at parties and events subsidized by corporate tax deductions. She looked around the table. Even your current success depends on government support. The trademark protections for Yeezy enforced by federal agencies, the contracts with retailers protected by commercial law and courts, the international expansion of your brand made possible by trade agreements and diplomatic relationships maintained by governments. Kanye tried to interrupt, but his usual bluster was gone. That's different. Everyone benefits from infrastructure. Exactly, Crockett said, her voice rising for the first time. Everyone benefits from infrastructure. Everyone benefits from public education, from research and development funding, from trade policies and legal protections. That's exactly my point, Kanye. She leaned forward in her chair. You didn't build your success in isolation. You built it on a foundation of collective investment, public infrastructure, and government support. But instead of supporting policies that would give other creators the same opportunities, you sit here and lecture people about not needing help. She pulled out her phone and showed the screen to the room. This is your Twitter account from last month. You posted about how taxes are theft, how government programs make people lazy, how real entrepreneurs don't need assistance. But your entire career, your entire fortune exists because of exactly the kind of collective investment you now oppose. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Kanye stared at her, his mouth slightly open. And here's the part that really bothers me. Crockett continued, her voice dropping to a more personal tone. You use your platform to tell young people, especially young black people, that they should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that they don't need systemic change, that individual genius is enough to overcome any obstacle. She stood up, commanding the room's attention. But that's not how you succeeded, Kanye. You succeeded because you had access to public education, because you benefited from government-funded research and infrastructure, because you lived in a society that invested in the conditions that made your success possible. She looked directly at him. And now that you've made it, you want to pull the ladder up behind you. You want to convince other people that they shouldn't expect the same support that helped you succeed. Kanye finally found his voice, but it was weaker than before. I worked hard for everything I have. I don't doubt that you worked hard, Crockett replied, but so do millions of other people who never get the opportunities you had. So do the teachers who educated you, the researchers who developed the technology you use, the workers who manufacture your products. She gathered her papers and placed them back in her portfolio. The difference between us, Kanye, is that I'm trying to create more opportunities for more people. You're trying to protect your own wealth by convincing people that the systems that helped you succeed are somehow their enemy. She looked around the room at the other attendees. This is what happens when we worship individual success without acknowledging collective investment. We get people who think their wealth makes them geniuses, who think their success gives them the right to lecture others about how the world works. She headed toward the door, then turned back. Kanye, you're not a business genius. You're a talented artist who was lucky enough to live in a society that invested in your potential. The least you could do is support policies that would give other people the same chance. And with that, she walked out of the conference room. The silence that followed was deafening. Kanye sat slumped in his chair, looking like he'd been hit by a truck. The Goldman Sachs executives were frantically checking their phones, probably calculating how much damage control they'd need to do. But the real damage was already spreading. Someone in the room had been live tweeting key quotes from the exchange. Within an hour, Crockett destroys Kanye was trending globally. The moment when she systematically broke down his business model was being shared millions of times. The response was immediate and brutal. Financial analysts began scrutinizing Yeezy's actual value versus its claimed worth. Journalists started digging into the company's reliance on Adidas and government-supported infrastructure. Business schools began using the exchange as a case study in the difference between individual talent and systemic success. But the real consequences came from the business world itself. Within 48 hours, 3 major investors had pulled out of planned Yeezy ventures, citing concerns about the brand's inflated valuation and Kanye's fundamental misunderstanding of business fundamentals. Adidas executives were reportedly reconsidering the terms of their partnership, worried about being associated with someone who'd been so thoroughly exposed as economically illiterate. The fashion industry, always sensitive to public perception, began distancing itself from Kanye. Major retailers started reducing their Yeezy orders. Fashion magazines pulled planned features. Celebrity endorsers quietly ended their associations with the brand. Most damaging was the scrutiny of Yeezy's actual financial performance. When analysts dug deeper into the company's books, they found exactly what Crockett had suggested. A brand whose value was largely theoretical, dependent on licensing deals and projected future earnings, rather than sustainable business fundamentals. Within a month, Yeezy's valuation had dropped from $6 billion to $3.8 billion. Kanye's personal net worth plummeted by over $200 million as investors and partners reassessed their relationships with him. The man who'd lectured a congresswoman about business acumen had been exposed as someone who didn't understand the basic economics of his own success. The broader cultural impact was even more significant. Crockett's systematic breakdown of Kanye's mythology had shown people how individual success stories are often built on collective investment. Young entrepreneurs began questioning the genius founder narrative that had dominated business culture for decades. 6 months later, Kanye's influence had waned significantly. His business ventures struggled to find new investors. His political commentary was largely ignored. The man who'd positioned himself as a visionary leader had been revealed as someone who'd confused luck and timing with genius and insight. Crockett, meanwhile, saw her legislation on creative industry support pass through committee with bipartisan backing. Her systematic approach to policy, combined with her ability to cut through celebrity nonsense, had earned her respect across the political spectrum. In her first interview after the Goldman Sachs encounter, she was asked what she'd hoped to accomplish. "I wanted to show people the difference between real business understanding and celebrity mythology," she said. Kanye represents this toxic idea that individual success happens in isolation, that wealthy people deserve their wealth purely through personal merit. She paused. But that's not how economics works. That's not how society works. When we pretend that successful people succeeded entirely on their own, we ignore all the collective investment that made their success possible. And when we do that, we make it harder to justify the continued investment that could help other people succeed. The lesson was clear: in an age of social media and instant fact-checking, celebrity status doesn't protect you from economic reality. And when someone with real expertise confronts someone who's been coasting on mythology and self-promotion, the truth has a way of cutting through years of carefully constructed persona. Kanye West thought he could lecture Jasmine Crockett about business and dismiss her as just another politician who didn't understand the real world. Instead, she exposed the fundamental lie underlying his entire public persona: that he was a self-made genius rather than a talented artist who'd benefited from massive collective investment. The $200 million he lost wasn't just money. It was the price of having his mythology exposed by someone who actually understood how business, economics, and society really work. And in a world where authenticity and expertise matter more than ever, that's a price that no amount of celebrity status can protect you from paying.